A white manager named Richard humiliates a black guest, Malcolm, at a luxury hotel, making a scene that embarrasses Malcolm in front of everyone. What Richard doesn't realize is that Malcolm's response will lead to consequences far beyond what he anticipated. So, how does Malcolm handle the situation once the damage is done? Does he seek revenge, or does he find a way to address the prejudice? Stick around to find out. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy this tale, don't forget to subscribe. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the city as Malcolm Green's car pulled up to the entrance of the opulence Grand Hotel. The hotel was a shining beacon of luxury, known for its impeccable service and exclusive clientele. Its towering facade of glass and steel reflected the vibrant hues of the evening sky, signaling the start of another busy night for the hotel. People from all walks of life came to the opulence, but only those deemed worthy stayed within its gilded walls. Malcolm stepped out of his sleek black car, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He was a man in his mid-30s, with a commanding presence that came from years of hard work and success. His deep brown skin contrasted sharply with the crisp white shirt beneath his suit jacket, and his polished shoes gleamed as they touched the pavement. Everything about him spoke of success, from the confident way he carried himself to the quiet authority in his eyes. But as he approached the entrance, Malcolm noticed the stairs. The bellhop hesitated before rushing forward to take his luggage, while the doorman barely nodded in acknowledgement. It was subtle, but Malcolm had experienced it enough times to recognize the underlying suspicion. Despite his impeccable attire and the fact that he was a regular guest at luxury hotels across the world, some people still couldn't look past the color of his skin. Pushing those thoughts aside, Malcolm walked through the grand revolving doors and into the hotel's opulent lobby. The air was cool, scented with fresh flowers and expensive cologne. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, casting shimmering light across marble floors and plush seating areas. The atmosphere was one of quiet sophistication, with guests dressed in designer clothes, sipping champagne and chatting in hushed tones. Malcolm headed straight for the reception desk, where a young woman with a bright smile greeted him. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Opulence Grand Hotel. How may I assist you today?" Before Malcolm could respond, a man appeared beside the receptionist, his presence overshadowing her warm greeting. Richard Haynes, the hotel manager, was in his early 50s, with sharp features and salt and pepper hair neatly combed back. He wore a tailored suit that spoke of old money, and his eyes were cold, calculating. Richard had worked at the Opulence for over a decade and prided himself on maintaining the hotel's reputation for excellence. To him, excellence meant keeping the wrong kind of people out. As Richard approached, his gaze swept over Malcolm, taking in the expensive suit and confident posture. But it was clear that none of that mattered to him. His expression remained neutral, but there was a hardness in his eyes that Malcolm had seen many times before. "Good evening," Richard said, his tone clipped. "May I help you with something?" Malcolm offered a polite smile. "Yes, I have a reservation. The name's Malcolm Green." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of the name, but he quickly masked it with a professional smile. "Of course, Mr. Green. One moment, please." He turned to the receptionist and gave her a pointed look, silently instructing her to check the reservation. As the receptionist tapped away at her computer, Richard studied Malcolm more closely. There was something about this man that didn't sit right with him. Perhaps it was the way he walked into the hotel as if he belonged, or the confident air that surrounded him. But Richard had seen this type before. People who thought they could buy their way into any place, even if they didn't belong. The receptionist looked up from her screen, her smile faltering. "Mr. Green, I see your reservation here, but—" Richard cut her off. "I'll handle this," he said curtly. He turned to Malcolm with a look of thinly veiled skepticism. "Mr. Green, I'll need to see some identification, and if you have a credit card, I'll require that as well." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem with my reservation?" Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "No problem at all. We just have certain protocols we follow for all our guests. I'm sure you understand." Malcolm could feel the tension in the air, but he remained calm. I've already provided my details when I booked the room, he said evenly. But if you need to see my ID again, I'm happy to oblige. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his driver's license and a platinum credit card, handing them both to Richard. The manager took them with a faint sneer, glancing at the card as if expecting it to be declined. While Richard inspected the ID and credit card, a few other guests began to gather around, sensing something unusual. Whispers floated through the lobby, and Malcolm could feel their eyes on him. But he didn't flinch. This wasn't the first time he'd been treated this way, and it probably wouldn't be the last. Richard's eyes flicked back to Malcolm, his expression unchanged. Everything seems to be in order, he said, handing the items back. But we do require a little more information for security purposes. I'll need to know the exact nature of your stay, as well as the details of your business here in the city. Malcolm frowned. Is that really necessary? I've never been asked for such details at any other hotel. It's our policy, Richard replied smoothly, though the sharpness in his voice was unmistakable. We take the safety and security of our guests very seriously. Malcolm's eyes narrowed slightly, but he kept his voice level. I'm here for a business meeting. That's all you need to know. Richard's lips thinned, clearly dissatisfied with the response, but he nodded curtly. Very well. I'll have someone show you to your room. Malcolm took back his ID and credit card, slipping them into his wallet. Thank you, he said, his tone polite but firm. He could feel the frustration bubbling beneath the surface, but he refused to let it show. Just then, a tall, slender woman in a pristine uniform appeared at Richard's side. Sophia, one of the hotel's senior concierges, offered Malcolm a warm smile. Mr. Green, if you'll follow me, I'll escort you to your suite. Malcolm nodded his thanks, his gaze lingering on Richard for a moment longer before turning to follow Sophia. As they walked away, he could hear the hushed murmurs of the other guests, their curiosity piqued by the unusual interaction. But Malcolm kept his head held high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. Behind him, Richard watched with a sense of smug satisfaction. He had made it clear that people like Malcolm weren't welcome here, no matter how much money they had. In Richard's mind, the opulence Grand Hotel was a place for the elite, and Malcolm Green didn't fit that mold. As Sophia led Malcolm to the private elevator reserved for VIP guests, she tried to lighten the mood with small talk. I hope your journey wasn't too tiring, Mr. Green. We've prepared one of our finest suites for you. I'm sure you'll find it very comfortable. Thank you, Sophia, Malcolm replied, his voice measured. I appreciate your help. They rode the elevator in silence after that, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken tension. Malcolm couldn't help but replay the encounter with Richard in his mind. He had been expecting a warm welcome, but instead, he was met with suspicion and hostility. It was a reminder that no matter how far he'd come in life, there were still those who would judge him solely by the color of his skin. When the elevator doors opened, Sophia gestured toward the suite at the end of the hallway. Here we are, Mr. Green. If you need anything at all during your stay, please don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you, Sophia, Malcolm said again, offering her a brief smile. He entered the suite and closed the door behind him, finally allowing himself a moment to breathe. The suite was nothing short of luxurious. The spacious living area was elegantly furnished, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. A bottle of champagne chilled in a silver bucket on the coffee table, and a welcome note sat beside it, handwritten in elegant script. Everything was designed to make guests feel pampered and at ease. But as Malcolm stood in the center of the lavish room, he couldn't shake the lingering bitterness from his encounter with Richard. He had come to the city for an important business meeting, but now his thoughts were clouded with the memory of the hotel manager's cold, dismissive attitude. Malcolm walked over to the windows, staring out at the city below. The lights of the city twinkled like stars, but they did little to lift his spirits. He had worked hard to get where he was, building a successful business from the ground up. He had faced countless challenges along the way, but nothing stung quite like the casual racism he encountered in places like this. Taking a deep breath, Malcolm reminded himself that he wasn't here to dwell on negativity. He had a meeting to prepare for, and that was his priority. But even as he tried to push the encounter out of his mind, A part of him couldn't help but wonder how many others had been treated the same way by people like Richard. How many had been turned away, humiliated, or made to feel like they didn't belong. Malcolm shook his head, forcing the thoughts aside. He had bigger things to focus on. But as he sat down at the desk to review his notes for the meeting, he made a silent vow. He wouldn't let Richard's prejudice go unanswered. The man had tried to put him in his place, but Malcolm was determined to show him that his place was wherever he chose to be. Later that evening, after settling into his suite, Malcolm decided to explore the hotel's amenities. The Opulence Grand was known for its world-class facilities, and he was curious to see what it had to offer. He changed into more casual attire, a navy polo shirt and tailored trousers, and headed down to the hotel's exclusive lounge. The lounge was a sleek, modern space with low lighting, plush seating, and a well-stocked bar. Jazz music played softly in the background, adding to the sophisticated ambience. A few guests were scattered around the room, sipping cocktails and chatting quietly. Malcolm found a seat near the windows and ordered a drink, intending to relax for a while before calling it a night. But just as his drink arrived, Richard Haynes walked into the lounge. Malcolm noticed him immediately, the sight of the hotel manager bringing a sour taste to his mouth. Richard hadn't seen him yet, and Malcolm debated whether to ignore him or make his presence known. Richard, however, spotted Malcolm after a moment, and his expression darkened. The manager made his way over, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He approached Malcolm's table, his posture stiff with barely concealed disdain. "Mr. Green," Richard said coolly, "I see you're enjoying our lounge. I trust everything is to your satisfaction." Malcolm looked up at him, his expression unreadable. "Yes, everything's fine, thank you." Richard nodded, though there was no warmth in his gesture. "I just wanted to make sure. You know, we have a reputation to uphold here. We strive to provide our guests with a certain standard of service and atmosphere." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "And you don't think I meet that standard?" Richard hesitated, but the arrogance in his voice was unmistakable. "Let's just say that we cater to a particular clientele, people who understand and appreciate what we offer." There it was, the thinly veiled insult, the subtle reminder that Malcolm didn't belong. But Malcolm wasn't in the mood to play along. He leaned back in his chair, regarding Richard with a calm that belied the simmering anger beneath. "Mr. Haynes," Malcolm began, his voice steady, "I've traveled the world, stayed in some of the finest hotels, and dined in the most exclusive restaurants. I know exactly what kind of clientele you're talking about. And let me tell you, it has nothing to do with the color of their skin." Richard's face flushed, but he quickly composed himself. "I assure you, Mr. Green, race has nothing to do with it. We simply maintain high standards." Malcolm smiled faintly. "You might want to reevaluate what those standards are." With that, Malcolm stood, leaving his untouched drink on the table. He walked past Richard, who remained rooted to the spot, and left the lounge without another word. As he made his way back to his suite, Malcolm felt a surge of determination. He wasn't done with Richard Haynes. Not by a long shot. This was just the beginning. The next morning, Malcolm Green woke up early, his mind sharp and clear. The events of the previous evening were still fresh in his memory, but rather than dwelling on them with anger, he felt a sense of calm determination. He knew he had the upper hand, and now it was just a matter of deciding how to use it. After a quick shower, Malcolm dressed in another tailored suit, this one a deep charcoal gray that exuded quiet confidence. He checked his watch. He had a few hours before his meeting, plenty of time to handle the situation with Richard Haynes. Today, the manager would learn the true meaning of consequences. Malcolm made his way downstairs to the hotel's dining area, where a lavish breakfast spread awaited guests. The room was filled with the clink of silverware and the murmur of polite conversation. As he entered, Malcolm noticed a few curious glances, but most of the guests were too engrossed in their own affairs to pay him much attention. He selected a table near the large windows, where sunlight streamed in, casting a warm glow over the room. A waiter approached, offering a friendly smile as he took Malcolm's order. It was a stark contrast to the treatment he had received from Richard the night before, but Malcolm knew that the difference lay not in the waiter's attitude, but in the fact that Richard had let his prejudice blind him. As Malcolm sipped his coffee, he mentally reviewed his plan. He would deal with Richard carefully, not revealing his true identity until the time was right. There was no need for anger or confrontation, just a simple, quiet demonstration of power that would leave no room for doubt about who was really in charge. About halfway through his meal, Malcolm saw Richard enter the dining room, his gaze sweeping over the tables as if he were inspecting the guests. When their eyes met, Richard's expression hardened, but he quickly masked it with a thin smile as he approached Malcolm's table. "Good morning, Mr. Green," Richard said, his tone devoid of warmth. "I trust you had a pleasant night's rest?" Malcolm looked up from his plate, his expression calm. "I did, thank you. The suite is quite comfortable." "I'm glad to hear it," Richard replied, though his eyes told a different story. "If there's anything you need during your stay, don't hesitate to ask. We aim to provide our guests with the highest level of service." Malcolm smiled faintly, sensing the tension beneath Richard's polite facade. "I appreciate that. Actually, there is something I'd like to discuss." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded. "Of course. What can I help you with?" Malcolm set down his coffee cup and leaned back in his chair, studying Richard for a moment before speaking. "I'd like to meet with the general manager. There are a few things I'd like to go over regarding my stay here." The request seemed to catch Richard off guard, and for a brief moment, his mask slipped, revealing a flash of annoyance. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Mr. Green. As the hotel manager, I'm the one responsible for overseeing guest services. If you have any concerns, you can bring them to me." Malcolm didn't miss the way Richard's voice tightened as he spoke, but he maintained his composed demeanor. "I understand, but I believe this matter requires the attention of the general manager. It's nothing personal. I'm sure you're quite capable, but I'd like to ensure that my concerns are addressed at the highest level." Richard's smile was more of a grimace now, but he kept his tone polite. "As I said, Mr. Green, I'm more than capable of handling whatever concerns you may have. There's no need to trouble the general manager with minor issues." Malcolm inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the subtle challenge in Richard's words. "I see. Well, in that case, I'll be sure to mention your confidence in your abilities when I do speak with the general manager." Richard stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he tried to gauge Malcolm's intentions. "Mr. Green, I assure you there's no need to escalate this matter. I'm fully authorized to handle any issues that may arise during your stay." Malcolm simply smiled, his expression giving nothing away. "I appreciate your dedication, Mr. Haynes. I'm sure you'll do your best to address my concerns." The conversation ended there, with Richard offering a curt nod before turning and walking away. As Malcolm watched him leave, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Richard had no idea who he was dealing with, and that ignorance would only make what came next all the more impactful. After finishing his breakfast, Malcolm returned to his suite. He took out his phone and made a few discreet calls, his voice low and measured as he spoke. There was no need for theatrics or grand gestures. Just a few words in the right ears would set everything in motion. With the calls made, Malcolm turned his attention to the rest of his plan. He knew that Richard would continue to treat him with disdain, and he intended to give the manager enough rope to hang himself. The key was patience, letting Richard dig himself deeper into the hole he was so eager to create. Later that morning, Malcolm decided to explore the hotel's facilities. The Opulence Grand was known for its world-class amenities, and Malcolm had no intention of letting Richard's behavior ruin his experience. He visited the spa, where he enjoyed a relaxing massage, followed by a dip in the rooftop pool. The staff in these areas were professional and courteous, treating him with the respect that all guests deserved. It was clear that Richard's attitude wasn't representative of the entire hotel, just a particularly ugly exception. By early afternoon, Malcolm was feeling refreshed and ready for his upcoming meeting. He returned to his suite to change, donning a crisp white shirt and a navy suit that exuded understated elegance. As he adjusted his tie in the mirror, his phone buzzed on the bedside table. Picking it up, he saw a message confirming that everything was in place. The stage was set, and all that remained was for Richard to play his part. Malcolm made his way to the hotel's business center, a sleek and modern space designed for high-powered meetings. As he entered, he saw Richard standing near the reception desk, engaged in a heated conversation with one of the staff members. The manager's expression was one of barely concealed frustration, but he quickly composed himself when he noticed Malcolm approaching. "Mr. Green," Richard said, forcing a smile as he stepped forward. "Is everything to your satisfaction?" Malcolm nodded. "Yes, everything's fine. I'm here for a meeting in the conference room." Richard's eyes flicked to the schedule on the screen behind the desk, and Malcolm could see the flicker of recognition as he read the details. "Ah, of course. We have you booked in the executive conference room. I'll personally ensure that everything is prepared for your meeting." "Thank you," Malcolm replied, his tone neutral. "I appreciate your attention to detail." Richard inclined his head slightly, but there was a hint of something in his eyes. Suspicion, perhaps, or maybe just the discomfort of not knowing exactly who he was dealing with. Either way, Malcolm knew it wouldn't be long before Richard's true colors showed themselves again. As the staff prepared the conference room, Malcolm took a seat in the lounge area, reviewing his notes for the meeting. He could feel Richard's eyes on him from across the room, the manager's curiosity piqued by the apparent importance of the event. But Malcolm remained calm, biding his time. When the meeting finally began, it was clear that Richard was struggling to maintain his composure. He hovered near the door, occasionally glancing inside, as if trying to piece together the puzzle that was Malcolm Green. But Malcolm paid him no mind, focusing instead on the business at hand. The meeting went smoothly, and by the time it ended, Malcolm was more convinced than ever that his plan would work. As the other attendees filed out of the conference room, Malcolm lingered behind, allowing Richard to approach him once more. The manager's expression was a mix of curiosity and unease, his polite facade beginning to crack under the pressure of his own suspicions. "Mr. Green," Richard began, his voice carefully measured, "I hope your meeting was productive. If there's anything else you need during your stay, please don't hesitate to let me know." Malcolm looked at him, his gaze steady and unyielding. "Actually, there is something I'd like to discuss with you, Mr. Haynes." Richard's eyes flicked with interest, but he kept his tone neutral. "Of course. What can I assist you with?" Malcolm gestured for Richard to take a seat, and the manager complied, though his posture remained stiff and guarded. "I wanted to get your perspective on a few things," Malcolm began, his tone casual, but with an undercurrent of purpose. "Specifically, your approach to management here at the Opulence Grand. I'm curious to know how you maintain such high standards." Richard blinked, clearly caught off guard by the question. "Well, Mr. Green, it's all about attention to detail. We have strict policies in place to ensure that our guests receive the best possible experience. That means being selective about who we allow to stay here and making sure that everyone upholds our standards of behavior." Malcolm nodded, feigning interest. "I see. And how do you decide who meets those standards?" Richard hesitated, sensing that this was more than just idle curiosity. "We evaluate each guest on a case-by-case basis," he said carefully. "It's important to maintain the right atmosphere at a hotel like this." Malcolm's gaze didn't waver. He knew exactly what Richard was implying, even if the manager was trying to dress it up in polite language. "And by the right atmosphere, you mean an environment where only a certain type of guest feels comfortable? Perhaps a type that aligns with your personal preferences?" Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the implication hanging heavily in the air. "Mr. Green, I assure you, we don't discriminate against anyone. Our policies are designed to maintain a level of exclusivity, but that's simply because our clientele expects it." "Exclusivity," Malcolm repeated, the word rolling off his tongue with a hint of disdain. "And does that exclusivity extend to people who look like me?" Richard's composure faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. "As I said, we don't discriminate. However, we do expect our guests to meet certain standards." Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but firm. "Tell me, Mr. Haynes, what exactly are those standards? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like the only standard you're concerned about is skin color." Richard bristled, his mask of professionalism slipping as his frustration began to show. "Mr. Green, I think you're misinterpreting our policies. We're simply trying to maintain the luxury and prestige that our guests expect." Malcolm smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Haynes, and I want you to understand something as well. I'm not the kind of person who lets things like this slide, but I'm also not the kind of person who acts out of anger." Richard's eyes narrowed, sensing a shift in the conversation. "What exactly are you saying, Mr. Green?" Malcolm's smile widened, though it remained cold. "I'm saying that you're going to learn a very important lesson about what it means to judge someone based on your prejudices. And I think it's time you learned that lesson the hard way." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Malcolm continued. "But before we get to that, I have a few more questions for you. For example, how do you handle complaints from guests? What's your process for addressing issues?" Richard hesitated, clearly unsure of where this was going. "We take all complaints seriously and address them promptly. Our goal is to ensure that our guests are satisfied and that their concerns are resolved to their satisfaction." "Interesting," Malcolm said, his tone thoughtful. "And how do you determine whether a complaint is valid? Do you take the guest's word for it? Or do you have to be convinced that their issue is worth your time?" Richard's discomfort was growing more evident with each passing minute. "We evaluate each situation individually. It's important to listen to the guest, but we also have to consider the bigger picture." "The bigger picture," Malcolm echoed. "And what does that picture look like to you, Mr. Haynes?" Richard's patience was wearing thin, and he struggled to keep his tone civil. "Mr. Green, I'm not sure what you're trying to imply, but I assure you, our policies are fair and equitable." Malcolm didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, placing it on the table between them. "I've been recording this conversation, Mr. Haynes. I think it'll be interesting to see how your words hold up when they're played back for your superiors." Richard's eyes widened in shock, his composure finally cracking. "You've been recording me? Without my permission?" Malcolm's gaze remained steady. "I don't need your permission to record a conversation that involves discriminatory behavior. And let's be clear, you've made it very obvious that you believe certain people don't belong in this hotel. That's not just unethical, Mr. Haynes. It's illegal." The color drained from Richard's face, and he quickly tried to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Green, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I never meant to." "Save it," Malcolm interrupted, his voice firm. "I don't want to hear your excuses. I've given you plenty of chances to do the right thing, and you've chosen to dig yourself deeper into this hole. Now, you're going to face the consequences." Richard's panic was evident now, and he stammered as he tried to backpedal. "Mr. Green, please, let's talk about this. I can assure you, we can resolve this matter amicably." Malcolm stood up, his posture commanding as he looked down at Richard. "Oh, we'll resolve it, Mr. Haynes, but not the way you're hoping. I've already made the necessary calls, and by the end of the day, your superiors will be fully aware of how you've been running things here." Richard's eyes darted around the room, as if searching for an escape. "Mr. Green, I didn't mean to offend you. I was just trying to do my job." "Your job?" Malcolm's voice was cold. "Your job is to ensure that every guest is treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their race. You've failed spectacularly at that, and now you're going to pay the price." With that, Malcolm turned and walked away, leaving Richard sitting there in stunned silence. The manager's arrogant facade had crumbled, and all that was left was a man who had just realized the full extent of his mistakes. As Malcolm made his way out of the business center, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Richard had no idea what was coming, and that was exactly how Malcolm wanted it. There was still much to be done, but the first move had been made, and now it was only a matter of time before the rest of the pieces fell into place. Later that afternoon, Malcolm returned to his suite to prepare for his next steps. He knew that Richard would likely try to cover his tracks, but it was too late for that. The wheels were already in motion, and soon enough, Richard would be answering for his actions. As the day wore on, Malcolm received confirmation that his calls had been successful. The higher-ups at the hotel chain had been informed of the situation, and they were not pleased. Arrangements were being made for an internal review, and Richard Haynes would be at the center of it. But Malcolm wasn't done yet. He wanted to ensure that Richard's downfall was thorough and complete. To that end, he made a few more discreet inquiries, gathering information that would paint a clear picture of Richard's behavior over the years. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for: complaints from other guests, whispers among the staff, and a pattern of prejudice that had gone unchecked for far too long. By the time evening rolled around, Malcolm was ready. He had everything he needed to bring Richard down, and he was prepared to do so with the same calm, methodical approach he had used all along. As the morning light streamed through the windows of the hotel's grand lobby, Malcolm Green sat quietly in one of the plush armchairs, waiting. He sipped his coffee slowly, his mind focused on the task ahead. The meeting with Lisa Turner, the general manager, was scheduled to take place in less than an hour. Malcolm had already made all the necessary arrangements, and now it was just a matter of time. Across the lobby, Richard Haynes paced nervously near the reception desk. Despite the recent confrontation with Malcolm, Richard had convinced himself that he was in control of the situation. He believed that whatever complaints Malcolm had raised could be smoothed over, and he could continue running the hotel as he always had. Richard's arrogance blinded him to the reality of what was about to unfold. Malcolm glanced at his watch. The timing was perfect. He knew that Lisa Turner was already on her way, having received his call the previous evening. She had been shocked to hear from him directly, but Malcolm had reassured her that it was a matter of utmost importance. Lisa was no stranger to high-profile guests, but this situation was different. Malcolm was not just any guest. He was a powerful figure within the hotel's parent company, a man whose influence extended far beyond the walls of this luxury establishment. A few minutes later, the sound of high heels clicking against the marble floor caught Malcolm's attention. He looked up to see Lisa Turner entering the lobby, her expression focused and professional. She was a tall, elegant woman in her early 40s, with sharp features and an air of authority. As she approached the reception desk, Richard hurried to greet her, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. "Good morning, Miss Turner," Richard said, forcing a smile as he extended his hand. "I wasn't expecting you today. Is there something I can assist you with?" Lisa shook his hand briefly, her expression unreadable. "Good morning, Mr. Haynes. I was informed of an urgent situation involving one of our guests, so I decided to come down and handle it personally." Richard's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, I see. Well, I assure you, everything is under control. There was a bit of a misunderstanding with one of our guests, but I'm taking care of it." "Is that so?" Lisa replied coolly. "And which guest would that be?" Before Richard could respond, Malcolm stood up and walked over to join them. The moment Lisa saw him, her demeanor softened, and a genuine smile appeared on her face. "Mr. Green," Lisa said warmly, extending her hand. "It's so good to see you again. I wasn't expecting you to be staying with us this week." Malcolm shook her hand, matching her smile. "Likewise, Miss Turner. I apologize for the short notice, but I had some business to attend to in the area." Richard's eyes widened as he watched the exchange, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. Why was Lisa Turner, the general manager, treating Malcolm with such deference? And why had she addressed him as Mr. Green? The name rang a bell, but Richard couldn't place it. "Of course," Lisa said, turning to Malcolm with a look of concern. "I understand there's been an issue during your stay. I'm here to make sure everything is resolved to your satisfaction." Malcolm nodded, his expression calm but serious. "Thank you, Ms. Turner. I appreciate your prompt attention. There are indeed some matters that need addressing." Lisa's gaze shifted to Richard, who was now standing frozen in place, his mind racing. "Mr. Haynes," she said, her tone still professional but with an edge to it, "I trust you've been made aware of the situation involving Mr. Green?" Richard's mouth went dry as he struggled to respond. Yes, I have. But I wasn't aware that I'm not just another guest?" Malcolm finished for him, his voice steady. "It's clear you weren't aware of many things, Mr. Haynes." Richard's confusion deepened, and he turned to Lisa for some kind of explanation. "Ms. Turner, who exactly is Mr. Green?" The tension in the air was palpable as Lisa glanced at Malcolm, who gave her a small nod, signaling her to proceed. She turned back to Richard, her expression now completely serious. "Mr. Haynes," she began, "Mr. Malcolm Green is not only a valued guest at our hotel, but he also happens to be one of the largest shareholders in the entire hotel chain. He's a prominent member of the board, with considerable influence over the direction and policies of this company." Richard's face drained of color as the weight of her words sank in. Malcolm Green, a man he had humiliated, belittled, and dismissed, was one of the owners of the very hotel he managed. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks, leaving him speechless. For a long moment, Richard could do nothing but stare at Malcolm, his mind reeling. When he finally found his voice, it was shaky and filled with desperation. "Mr. Green, I had no idea. Please, you have to understand. I was only trying to uphold the standards of the hotel. If I had known. But you didn't know," Malcolm interrupted, his voice firm but measured. "And that's the problem, Mr. Haynes. You judge me based on assumptions, not facts. You allowed your personal biases to dictate how you treated me, and you did so without any regard for the consequences." Richard's mouth opened and closed as he struggled to find the right words. "Mr. Green, I'm truly sorry. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. I never meant to offend you or anyone else. Whether or not you meant to doesn't change the fact that you did," Malcolm replied, his gaze unwavering. "Your behavior was not only unprofessional, but it was also discriminatory. And that's something I cannot and will not tolerate." Lisa Turner remained silent, letting Malcolm take the lead. She knew that this was his moment, and she trusted him to handle it in the way he saw fit. Several hotel staff members had gathered nearby, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. A few guests had also stopped to watch, their expressions a mix of intrigue and disbelief. It wasn't every day that they witnessed such a confrontation in a place like this. Richard's hands trembled as he tried to salvage the situation. "Mr. Green, please give me a chance to make this right. I'll do whatever it takes." Malcolm considered him for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Haynes, I could easily have you fired right here and now. Given the gravity of your actions, it would be well within my rights to do so." Richard's heart pounded in his chest, the fear of losing everything he had worked for overwhelming him. "Please, Mr. Green," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I'll do anything. Just tell me what you want." Malcolm's expression softened slightly, though his gaze remained stern. "What I want, Mr. Haynes, is not just for you to apologize to me, but for you to recognize the harm you've caused and take responsibility for it. And not just to me, but to your staff and to every guest you've treated unfairly." Richard blinked, taken aback by Malcolm's words. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you need to apologize publicly," Malcolm said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You need to acknowledge your actions in front of your staff and your guests, and you need to make it clear that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated in this hotel, or any hotel in this chain." Richard swallowed hard, the idea of such a public apology terrifying him. But what will that accomplish? It will ruin my reputation, my career." Malcolm shook his head. "Your reputation is already tarnished, Mr. Haynes. But this isn't just about you. It's about sending a message that prejudice and discrimination have no place here. You've been given an opportunity to learn from your mistakes and to set an example for others. Whether you take that opportunity is up to you." The weight of Malcolm's words hung heavy in the air as Richard realized that there was no way out of this. He could either follow through with a public apology and attempt to redeem himself, or he could refuse and face even harsher consequences. Lisa Turner finally spoke, her voice firm. "Mr. Haynes, I suggest you take Mr. Green's offer seriously. This is your chance to show that you're willing to change and to take responsibility for your actions." Richard nodded slowly, his expression one of resignation. I understand. I'll do it. I'll apologize." Malcolm's eyes remained on Richard, searching for any sign of insincerity. Satisfied that the manager was genuinely remorseful, he gave a curt nod. "Good. We'll make the arrangements." Over the next few hours, preparations were made for the public apology. The staff was notified, and a small gathering was arranged in one of the hotel's conference rooms. Word quickly spread among the guests, and many expressed interest in attending. The anticipation in the air was palpable, with everyone curious to see how the situation would unfold. When the time came, Malcolm stood at the front of the room, flanked by Lisa Turner and a few other senior staff members. Richard stood beside him, looking pale and nervous. The room was filled with hotel employees and guests, all watching intently. Malcolm took a deep breath before addressing the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today. I know that this is an unusual gathering, but it's an important one. We're here to address an incident that occurred earlier this week, an incident that involved prejudice, discrimination, and a violation of the values this hotel stands for." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Mr. Haynes has something he would like to say. Richard stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he faced the crowd. I want to start by saying that I'm deeply sorry for my actions, he began, his voice wavering. I allowed my personal biases to cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I treated a guest in a manner that was both unprofessional and unacceptable. He glanced at Malcolm, who gave him a reassuring nod, encouraging him to continue. I realize now that my behavior was rooted in prejudice, and I understand the hurt and harm it caused. For that, I sincerely apologize to Mr. Green, to the staff, and to all of our guests. I am committed to learning from this experience and to doing better in the future. Richard's voice grew stronger as he spoke, the weight of his confession lifting slightly from his shoulders. Moving forward, I will participate in diversity and sensitivity training, as recommended by Mr. Green. I know that words alone are not enough, and I'm dedicated to taking concrete actions to ensure that everyone who walks through these doors is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. The room was silent as Richard finished his apology, the gravity of the moment sinking in. Malcolm stepped forward once again, his voice calm and steady. Thank you, Mr. Haynes. I believe that change is possible, but it requires a willingness to acknowledge our mistakes and to take responsibility for them. I hope that this is a step in the right direction. He turned to the crowd, addressing them directly. Let this serve as a reminder to all of us that we must hold ourselves and each other accountable. Discrimination in any form is unacceptable, and it's up to each of us to create an environment where everyone feels welcome and valued. With that, the meeting came to a close. The staff and guests slowly dispersed, leaving Malcolm and Lisa standing side by side. Richard lingered for a moment, glancing at Malcolm with a look of gratitude before quietly exiting the room. As the conference room emptied, Malcolm felt a sense of satisfaction. He had handled the situation with grace and integrity, choosing a path that allowed for both accountability and growth. He knew that Richard's journey was far from over, but he hoped that the manager would take the lessons learned here and apply them moving forward. Lisa turned to Malcolm, a smile of admiration on her face. You handled that beautifully, Mr. Green. Not many people would have taken the approach you did. Malcolm smiled back. Thank you, Ms. Turner. I've always believed that true change comes from understanding and education. If we can use these moments to teach, rather than simply punish, then we have a chance at making a real difference. Lisa nodded in agreement. I couldn't agree more. And I want you to know that I'll be following up on all the initiatives we discussed. This hotel, and our entire chain, will be better because of it. Malcolm appreciated her commitment. I'm confident that you will, Ms. Turner, and I'll be keeping an eye on things as well. With that, the two of them shook hands, sealing their shared commitment to the future. As Malcolm left the hotel later that day, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The confrontation had led to revelation, and the revelation had led to a commitment to change. In the weeks following the incident at the Opulence Grand Hotel, Malcolm Green found himself reflecting deeply on the events that had transpired. While he had achieved his immediate goal of addressing Richard Haynes' discriminatory behavior, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more work to be done. The hotel industry, like many others, had long-standing issues with diversity and inclusion, and Malcolm was determined to use his influence to bring about lasting change. One sunny morning, Malcolm sat in his home office, reviewing the latest reports from the Opulence Grand. True to her word, Lisa Turner had implemented a series of diversity training programs and policy changes. The feedback had been largely positive, with staff members reporting a more inclusive work environment. However, Malcolm knew that real change would require more than just a single hotel's efforts. With a determined sigh, he picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. After a few rings, a deep voice answered. Marcus Thompson speaking. Marcus, it's Malcolm, he said, leaning back in his chair. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. For you, Malcolm? Never. Marcus chuckled. What's on your mind? Malcolm took a deep breath before diving in. I've been thinking about what happened at the Opulence Grand, and I believe we have an opportunity here. An opportunity to make some real changes in our industry. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Go on, Marcus said, his interest piqued. I want to propose a company-wide initiative, Malcolm continued. Not just diversity training, but a complete overhaul of our hiring practices, our customer service policies, everything. We need to set a new standard for inclusivity in the hospitality industry. Marcus let out a low whistle. That's ambitious, Malcolm. You know there will be resistance from some of the old guard. I know, Malcolm agreed. But if we don't do this now, when will we? We have the resources, the influence. It's time we use them for something more than just profits. There was another pause, longer this time. Malcolm could almost hear the gears turning in Marcus's head. Finally, the other man spoke. All right, Malcolm, you got my attention. Let's set up a board meeting for next week. I want to hear more about this plan of yours. Malcolm smiled, feeling a surge of excitement. Thank you, Marcus. I'll have a detailed proposal ready by then. As he hung up the phone, Malcolm felt a renewed sense of purpose. The incident with Richard Haynes had been a wake-up call, not just for the manager himself, but for Malcolm as well. It had shown him that he had the power to effect real change, and he was determined to use it. Over the next few days, Malcolm threw himself into research and planning. He consulted with diversity experts, pored over studies on inclusive business practices, and even reached out to other industries to see how they were addressing similar issues. By the time the board meeting rolled around, he had a comprehensive plan that he believed could transform their entire hotel chain. The day of the meeting arrived, and Malcolm found himself standing before the board of directors, a diverse group of men and women who held the power to approve or reject his proposal. As he began his presentation, he could feel the weight of their scrutiny, but he pressed on, conviction in his voice. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, what I'm proposing today is more than just a corporate initiative. It's a complete paradigm shift in how we approach diversity and inclusion in our hotels. He outlined his plan, which included revamping hiring practices to ensure a more diverse workforce at all levels, implementing comprehensive training programs for all staff members, and creating new customer service protocols designed to eliminate bias and discrimination. But it doesn't stop there, Malcolm continued. I want us to be leaders in this space. I propose we create a scholarship program for underprivileged students interested in hospitality management and partner with historically black colleges and universities to create internship opportunities. As he spoke, Malcolm could see the expressions on the board members' faces changing. Some looked intrigued, others skeptical, but all were paying close attention. I know this is a significant undertaking, Malcolm acknowledged as he neared the end of his presentation. But I believe it's not just the right thing to do morally, it's also good business. In today's world, customers are increasingly conscious of the values of the companies they support. By taking this step, we position ourselves as industry leaders and create a brand that truly stands for something. As Malcolm finished, the room fell silent. He looked around at the faces of his fellow board members, trying to gauge their reactions. Finally, Marcus Thompson, the CEO, spoke up. Malcolm, I have to say this is impressive, he began, his tone measured. It's also incredibly ambitious. What you're proposing would require a significant investment of time and resources. Malcolm nodded, prepared for this response. You're right, Marcus. It will require investment. But I believe the long-term benefits, both in terms of our reputation and our bottom line, will far outweigh the initial costs. Another board member, Janet Lee, leaned forward. I agree with Malcolm, she said, her voice firm. We've been talking about making changes like this for years. It's time we actually did something substantial. The discussion continued for over an hour, with board members raising questions and concerns. Malcolm addressed each one calmly and confidently, drawing on his extensive research and preparation. By the end of the meeting, he could sense a shift in the room. The skepticism hadn't entirely disappeared, but there was a palpable energy, a sense of possibility. Marcus called for a vote, and Malcolm held his breath as hands were raised. When the final tally was announced, he couldn't help but smile. The proposal had passed with a solid majority in favor. As the board members filed out of the room, many stopped to congratulate Malcolm on his presentation. Marcus was the last to leave, hanging back to speak with Malcolm privately. Well done, Malcolm, he said, clapping him on the shoulder. You've given us a lot to think about and a lot of work to do. I hope you're ready for the challenge. Malcolm nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and determination. More than ready, Marcus. This is just the beginning. Over the next few months, Malcolm found himself busier than ever as he worked to implement his ambitious plan. He assembled a task force of experts in diversity and inclusion, human resources professionals, and key staff members from various hotels in their chain. Together, they began the painstaking process of overhauling policies, creating new training programs, and developing partnerships with educational institutions. One afternoon, as Malcolm was reviewing the latest draft of their new hiring guidelines, his phone rang. It was Lisa Turner from the Opulence Grand. "Mr. Green," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. "I hope I'm not interrupting, but I wanted to share some news with you." "Not at all, Lisa," Malcolm replied, setting aside his paperwork. "What's happening?" "Well, remember that scholarship program you proposed? We've just selected our first recipient. Her name is Tanya Johnson, and she's a brilliant young woman from Southside Chicago. She'll be starting her hospitality management degree this fall." Malcolm felt a warmth spread through his chest. This was exactly the kind of impact he had hoped to make. "That's wonderful news, Lisa. I'd love to meet her when she starts her internship with us." "Of course," Lisa agreed. "And there's more. Remember Richard Haynes?" Malcolm's interest piqued. "Yes, of course. How is he doing?" "He's changed, Mr. Green," Lisa said, a note of surprise in her voice. "After completing his diversity training, he asked to be involved in our community outreach programs. He's been volunteering at local schools, talking to students about careers in hospitality. It's like he's a different person." Malcolm nodded, pleased but not entirely surprised. He had always believed in the power of education and second chances. "That's good to hear, Lisa. Keep me updated on his progress." As he hung up the phone, Malcolm felt a sense of satisfaction. The changes were starting to take effect, not just in policies and procedures, but in people's hearts and minds. It was a small start, but an important one. However, not everything was smooth sailing. As news of the company's new initiative spread, there was pushback from some quarters. A few longtime employees resigned, uncomfortable with the changes. Some customers threatened to take their business elsewhere, claiming the company had become too political. Malcolm had anticipated this resistance and was prepared to face it head-on. He wrote op-eds for major publications, explaining the importance of diversity and inclusion in the hospitality industry. He gave interviews, sharing his own experiences and the company's vision for the future. One particularly memorable moment came during a television interview with a skeptical host who questioned the need for such sweeping changes. "Mr. Green," the host began, his tone challenging, "some would say that your company is going too far, that you're prioritizing political correctness over customer service. How do you respond to that?" Malcolm leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I would say that those people fundamentally misunderstand what we're trying to achieve. This isn't about political correctness. It's about creating an environment where every guest, regardless of their background, feels welcome and valued. And it's about building a workforce that reflects the diversity of the communities we serve. That's not just good ethics, it's good business." The host pressed on. "But aren't you worried about alienating your traditional customer base?" Malcolm smiled. "Our traditional customer base is changing. The world is changing. We're not just reacting to that change, we're leading it. And I believe that the vast majority of our customers will appreciate and support that leadership." As the months passed, Malcolm's words proved prophetic. While there was some initial turbulence, the company began to see positive results from its new initiatives. Employee satisfaction scores increased, particularly among minority staff members who reported feeling more valued and supported. Customer feedback was overwhelmingly positive, with many guests specifically mentioning the diverse and welcoming atmosphere of the hotels. 1 year after the incident at the Opulence Grand, Malcolm found himself back at the hotel, this time for a very different reason. The company was hosting a gala to celebrate the success of their diversity and inclusion initiatives and to award scholarships to the next round of students entering their program. As Malcolm stood at the podium, looking out over the crowd of employees, industry partners, and scholarship recipients, he felt a profound sense of pride and accomplishment. "A year ago," he began, his voice strong and clear, "an unfortunate incident occurred in this very hotel. An incident that could have ended with anger and recrimination. Instead, it became the catalyst for change. Change not just in one hotel or one company, but in an entire industry." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. I see that change reflected in the faces before me tonight, in our employees, who now truly represent the diverse tapestry of our society, in our partners who have joined us on this journey towards greater inclusion, and in our scholarship recipients, the future leaders of our industry who will carry this torch forward. As Malcolm continued his speech, he noticed Richard Haynes standing near the back of the room. The former manager caught his eye and gave a small nod, a gesture of respect and gratitude. Malcolm nodded back, acknowledging the man's journey and growth. "But our work is far from over," Malcolm continued. "We've made great strides, but there is still much to be done. Discrimination and bias still exist in our society, and by extension, in our industry. It is up to all of us to continue this fight, to keep pushing for greater equality and inclusion." He raised his glass. "So tonight, we celebrate our achievements, but tomorrow we get back to work. Because every guest who walks through our doors deserves to feel welcome, respected, and valued. And every employee deserves to work in an environment where they can thrive, regardless of their race, gender, or background." As the room erupted in applause, Malcolm felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Tanya Johnson, the first recipient of their scholarship program, standing beside him. "Mr. Green," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "I just wanted to thank you. Without this program, I never would have had the opportunity to pursue my dreams. You've changed my life." Malcolm smiled warmly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "No, Tanya, you've changed your life. We just opened the door. What you do with this opportunity is up to you." As the gala continued, Malcolm found himself reflecting on the journey of the past year. What had started as a personal confrontation had grown into a movement, one that was reshaping an entire industry. There were still challenges ahead, he knew. Change was never easy, and there would always be those who resisted it. But looking around the room, seeing the diverse faces of employees, partners, and students, Malcolm felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was more than just about hotels or hospitality. It was about creating a world where everyone felt valued and respected, regardless of their background. As the evening drew to a close, Malcolm stepped out onto the hotel's balcony, looking out over the city lights. He thought about all the guests who would stay in their hotels, all the employees who would work there, all the lives that would be touched by the changes they were making. It wasn't perfect, he knew. There was still so much work to be done. But it was a start, a step in the right direction. And as he stood there, under the vast night sky, Malcolm Green made a silent promise to himself and to all those who would come after him. The promise to keep pushing forward, to keep fighting for equality and inclusion, to never stop striving for a world where everyone could feel at home, no matter where they were. Because in the end, that's what true hospitality was all about. As he turned to go back inside, Malcolm caught sight of his reflection in the glass door. The man looking back at him was older, wiser, and more determined than ever. He smiled, knowing that this was just the beginning of a long and important journey. A journey that would change not just an industry, but hopefully the world. As the years passed, Malcolm Green's initiatives at the Opulence Grand Hotel chain began to attract attention far beyond the hospitality industry. What had started as a response to a single incident of discrimination had grown into a movement, inspiring other companies and even policymakers to take a closer look at their own practices. On a crisp autumn morning, 5 years after the initial confrontation with Richard Haynes, Malcolm found himself preparing for a different kind of challenge. He had been invited to testify before a congressional committee on workplace diversity and inclusion. As he adjusted his tie in the mirror of his Washington, D.C. hotel room, he couldn't help but marvel at how far things had come. The hearing room was packed when Malcolm arrived. Journalists, industry leaders, and curious citizens filled the gallery, all eager to hear what he had to say. As he took his seat at the witness table, Malcolm caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. Tanya Johnson, now a successful hotel manager herself, gave him an encouraging smile. "Mr. Green," the committee chairwoman began, "your company's diversity and inclusion initiatives have been hailed as a model for the industry. Can you tell us what prompted these changes and what impact they've had?" Malcolm leaned towards the microphone, his voice clear and confident. It all started with a single incident of discrimination at one of our hotels. But rather than simply addressing that isolated event, we saw an opportunity to tackle the root causes of bias and inequality in our industry as a whole. He went on to detail the comprehensive changes they had implemented, from revamped hiring practices to ongoing training programs and community partnerships. The impact has been profound, he continued. We've seen increased employee satisfaction and retention, particularly among minority staff. Our customer base has grown more diverse, and our reputation has been enhanced. But most importantly, we've created an environment where everyone truly feels welcome and valued. The questions from the committee members ranged from supportive to skeptical, but Malcolm handled each one with the same calm assurance he had displayed in that board meeting years ago. When asked about the costs of implementing such sweeping changes, he didn't hesitate. Yes, there were initial costs, he acknowledged, but we found that the long-term benefits far outweigh those costs. A diverse and inclusive workplace is more innovative, more productive, and more in tune with the needs of a diverse customer base. It's not just the right thing to do morally, it's smart business. As the hearing concluded, Malcolm felt a sense of accomplishment. He had come here not just to share his company's success story, but to advocate for broader change. And judging by the thoughtful nods from the committee members, his message had resonated. Outside the hearing room, Malcolm was approached by a young woman in a sharp business suit. "Mr. Green," she said, extending her hand, "I'm Congresswoman Alicia Ramirez. I was really impressed by your testimony today." Malcolm shook her hand warmly. "Thank you, Congresswoman. I'm glad it was helpful." "More than helpful," she replied. "I'm working on a bill to incentivize diversity and inclusion practices in the private sector, and I'd love to get your input. Would you be willing to consult with my team?" Malcolm's eyes lit up at the prospect. "I'd be honored, Congresswoman. This is exactly the kind of broader change we need to see." As he left the Capitol building that afternoon, Malcolm felt a renewed sense of purpose. What had started in a single hotel had the potential to transform workplaces across the country. But he knew that with greater influence came greater responsibility, and there were still challenges ahead. One of those challenges presented itself a few months later, when Malcolm received a call from Lisa Turner at the Opulence Grand. "Mr. Green," she said, her voice tense, "we have a situation here that I think requires your attention." It turned out that one of their hotels in a small, conservative town was facing backlash from the local community. The hotel had recently hired a transgender woman as a front desk manager, and some local groups were calling for a boycott. Malcolm listened carefully as Lisa explained the situation. "How is the employee handling all this?" he asked. "Sarah's been incredibly professional," Lisa replied. "But I can tell it's taking a toll on her. Some of the other staff are getting nervous too." Malcolm nodded, even though Lisa couldn't see him. "I'm coming down there," he said firmly. "We need to address this head-on." 2 days later, Malcolm stood before a town hall meeting in the hotel's largest conference room. The atmosphere was tense, with angry murmurs rippling through the crowd. But Malcolm remained calm as he took the podium. "I understand that many of you are upset," he began, his voice steady. "Change can be uncomfortable. But I want to ask you all a question. When you check into a hotel, what matters most to you?" He paused, looking out over the sea of faces. Is it the color of the person's skin behind the desk? Their gender identity? Or is it the quality of service they provide? The warmth of their welcome? The efficiency with which they meet your needs? A hush fell over the room as people considered his words. Malcolm pressed on. "Sarah is an exceptional employee. She's professional, courteous, and highly skilled at her job. Those are the qualities that matter in hospitality. Those are the qualities we look for in all our employees." He took a deep breath before continuing. "Our company stands for inclusion. We believe that everyone deserves to feel welcome, both as guests and as employees. We won't compromise on that principle, no matter how much pressure we face. But we also believe in being good neighbors. We want to be a positive force in this community. So I'm here to listen to your concerns, to answer your questions, and hopefully, to find a way forward together." The discussion that followed was heated at times, but Malcolm maintained his composure throughout. He answered questions patiently, shared personal stories, and gently challenged assumptions. By the end of the evening, while not everyone was fully convinced, the mood in the room had shifted. The calls for boycott had quieted, replaced by thoughtful discussions about acceptance and community. As the crowd dispersed, Sarah approached Malcolm, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "I've never had anyone stand up for me like that before." Malcolm placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're part of our family now, Sarah, and we stand by our family." The incident in the small town made national news, further cementing Malcolm's reputation as a champion for diversity and inclusion. But it also brought new challenges. Conservative pundits accused him of pushing a woke agenda, while some activists criticized him for not going far enough. Malcolm weathered the storm with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout his career. He continued to advocate for change, not through grand gestures or inflammatory rhetoric, but through steady, consistent action and open dialogue. As his influence grew, Malcolm never forgot the incident that had started it all. He made a point of staying in touch with Richard Haynes, the former manager whose discriminatory actions had set this whole journey in motion. Richard had continued his personal growth, becoming an advocate for diversity in his own right. On the 10th anniversary of the confrontation at the Opulence Grand, Malcolm invited Richard to speak at a company-wide conference on inclusion. As Richard took the stage, visibly nervous, Malcolm gave him an encouraging nod. 10 years ago, I made a terrible mistake," Richard began, his voice shaky but determined. "I let my biases and prejudices control my actions, and in doing so, I not only hurt Mr. Green, but I betrayed everything that true hospitality stands for." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But Mr. Green did something I didn't expect. Instead of simply punishing me, he gave me an opportunity to learn, to grow, to become better. And in doing so, he didn't just change my life. He started a movement that has transformed our entire industry." As Richard continued his speech, Malcolm reflected on the journey they had all taken. The road hadn't always been smooth, and there were still obstacles ahead. But looking out at the diverse faces in the audience, seeing the pride and sense of belonging in their eyes, he knew that every challenge had been worth it. After the conference, Malcolm took a quiet moment alone on the hotel's rooftop terrace. The city sprawled out before him, a tapestry of lights and lives intertwined. He thought about all the people in those buildings, the hotel guests, the employees, the communities they served, each one with their own story, their own struggles and triumphs. He had started this journey wanting to right a single wrong, to address one incident of discrimination. But it had become so much more than that. It had become a mission to create a world where everyone, regardless of their background, could feel at home wherever they went. As the cool night air brushed against his face, Malcolm made a silent vow to keep pushing forward, to keep breaking down barriers, to keep building bridges. Because he knew that the work was far from over. There would always be new challenges, new forms of discrimination to combat, new minds to open. But he was ready for it, and he wasn't alone. He had built a community, a movement of people committed to making the world a more inclusive place, one interaction at a time. As he turned to go back inside, Malcolm caught his reflection in the glass door. The man looking back at him had grown older, lines of experience etched on his face. But his eyes still burned with the same passion, the same determination to make a difference. He smiled, knowing that while he had already accomplished more than he had ever dreamed possible, the most exciting chapters of this story were still to be written. And he couldn't wait to see what the future held. What would you have done if you were in Malcolm's position when Richard came to apologize? If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel. I put a lot of time and effort into crafting these impactful narratives, and your support truly means the world to me. Thank you for being a part of this journey.